In this first talk, we will consider Romanticism, more specifically Romanticism in crisis. Every country has its foundation myth. At the moment, the French Republic, the fifth one, lives on the foundation myth of 1789. This year marks the beginning of what we may call the long 19th century. Why 1789? In 1789, the French were doing what the French do. They were protesting. A famine, the independence of the United States, and ongoing tensions with our Spanish and British neighbours created an atmosphere that the English might tactfully describe as rather complicated. These were the last days of what is now known as the Ancien Régime. Since the medieval times, society was divided in three orders. The first order, that is to say, the clergy, whose duty was to pray. The second order, that's to say, the nobility, whose duty was to fight for the land. And the third estate, the third order, in charge of pretty much everything else. There is often a misunderstanding about the le tiers état, namely that its members would be uneducated, famished peasants, oppressed by evil landlords and manipulated by hypocritical priests. In fact, in the end of the 19th century, the third estate was about 97 or 98% of the population. The members of the third estates were peasants, but also rich farmers, factory owners, or bourgeois, that's to say city dwellers, who could be involved in trade, in liberal arts, and in the intellectual life of the salon. Voltaire, for instance, or Diderot, two prominent philosophers of the 18th century, were both members of the bourgeoisie, and their ideas had more influence on the educated elite of their time than on a peasant in the depth of the French countryside. Because of the military and economic context, the third estate at large had to pay increasing taxes to the clergy and to the nobility. And there was a growing frustration that people who had both the talents and the financial means to occupy influential positions could not, because they were not born with the right family name. In the Ancien Régime, the solution to such conflicts between the estates was a reunion of the Estates General, where delegates of the three orders could meet and present their requests to the king. Initially, Louis XVI refused to convey the Estates General, but accepted reluctantly. So on the 5th of May 1789, the reunion began. And a few days later, on the 20th of June, the members of the Third Estate seized the tennis court of Versailles, la salle du jeu de paume, summoned the nobility and clergy delegates, and refused to leave until France would have a constitution. Not even a month later, on the 14th of July, a popular riot shook Paris. The people stormed La Bastille. The guards eventually surrendered, but more than 100 of them were executed. This can seem surprising, given that there were only 7 inmates at La Bastille in that time, among whom le Marquis de Sade. So why storm it? What was so special about La Bastille? La Bastille was the dungeon where people could be sent par lettre de cachet, by direct order of the king, without due trial. Its destruction symbolized the destruction of the king's absolute authority. Symbolically, as early as the 14th of July 1789, absolute monarchy of divine right, as France knew it for centuries, was over. But the storming of the Bastille was not enough. The constitution that was drafted was never implemented, and eventually, on the 21st of January 1793, Louis XVI was beheaded. It is hard to understand the 19th century without an idea of the loss that happened through the terror, the regime that followed the death of the king. The clergy was to swear allegiance to the Republic or die on the scaffold. The nobility had to flee into exile or die on the scaffold. The revolutionaries, who did not have the right ideas about the revolution, died on the scaffold. Think of the works of art that were lost, destroyed, or never created. Think of the promising young writers like André de Chénier who were executed. What happened between 1792 and 1794 had direct consequences on the intellectual landscape of the following decades. So is French Romanticism a product of the French Revolution, or is it a revolution in itself between the 1810s and the 1820s, through which not only the past was shattered, but also new artistic norms established? Considering the radical changes that followed the French Revolution, the strong links between French Romanticism and the 18th century may seem surprising. But French Romanticism is directly influenced by Rousseau, for instance, aesthetically, politically, and anthropologically. In La Nouvelle Héloïse, published in 1761, Rousseau rewrites the story of Abélard and Héloïse, transposing it to the doomed love between a young aristocrat and her teacher, a man of noble heart but of common birth. The novel had a long-lasting success, was admired by Schopenhauer and by Mary Shelley, and created the template for two essential elements in Romanticism: doomed love and the analogy between emotions and landscapes, ideally near a Swiss lake. But French Romanticism did not only borrow the unbridled feelings of Rousseau's novel. For many authors, and particularly for Georges Sand and Victor Hugo, Rousseau's anthropology and political theory were as important as they were for the revolutionaries. The French Declaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, drafted by the Constituent Assembly of 1789, begins with the famous line, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights." Behind this principle, we can retrieve the opening line of Rousseau's social contract of 1762, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." The two are linked by the statement of freedom by birth, of a state of original liberty. For Rousseau and his followers, man is inherently good. Therefore, the pursuit of individual desires without the constraints of society could only lead to general happiness. What could possibly go wrong? Dubious as it may be as a philosophical principle, the freedom to express and explore feelings, at least within the margins of a work of fiction, coupled with the influence of Lord Byron and Goethe, offered us some of the most fascinating pages of French literature. Why Byron? Charles Baudelaire, the most important poet of French 19th century, wrote that Byron was the greatest of all. Byron created a type that the entire French 19th century had to reckon with. Through characters like Childe Harold and Manfred, Byron created the type of the hero who stands alone against everyone. The main character did not have to be a good man, but had to be a great man and a misunderstood outcast, whose emotions were more intense and refined than in the average of humanity. And why Goethe? Goethe started three decisive trends for French Romanticism. First, the Bildungsroman, through his novel Wilhelm Meister. Instead of focusing on an edifying tale through which vice is punished and virtue is rewarded, the Bildungsroman insists on the process of growth and change undergone by a character, be it moral or emotional. The events of the plot become less interesting than the effect they have on the character's psychology. Secondly, Goethe initiated the creation of Faust as one of the greatest modern myths. If Byron and Théophile Gautier made Don Juan great again, Goethe took Faust, that somehow obscure character of German folklore, and turned him into a romantic hero, inspiring French composers Gounod and Berlioz, and even, much later, the decadent Catulle-Mendès. But Goethe also stirred a wave of social contagion. Soon after the publication of Werther in 1774, young men started imitating the hero's attitudes, wearing yellow trousers and blue jackets, and there was even a trend of suicide by gunshot, as this is reported being one of the strongest waves of suicide contagion ever recorded. Romantic suicide, in reality and in fiction, was not just the response to rejection in a love affair. It became a gesture of revolt against the mediocrity of the post-Napoleonic world. The idea of equality, in fact, is incompatible with the very project of the romantic novel. What would be the point of writing a novel about a world where no one stands out as exceptional and where everyone is absolutely the same as everyone else? So while the Byronic hero provided a template for certain figures of French Romanticism, such as Alexandre Dumas' Edmond Dantès in The Count of Monte Cristo or Athos in The Three Musketeers, Goethe made it possible to explore the theme of suicide in literature. And both Byron and Goethe made nature the perfect frame for their characters' unbridled emotions. We could now sketch the stereotype of the French romantic hero, a young man of acute sensitivity, at odds with the world around him, whose growth is contingent upon an experience of suffering studied in an almost surgical way. This is what we see in such novels as Chateaubriand's René, published in 1802, Benjamin Constant's Adolphe, 1816, or Alfred de Musset, La Confession d'un enfant du siècle, in 1836. This trend radically changed the way the novel was perceived as a genre. The 17th and 18th century made novels tolerable by giving them a moral or philosophical function, as can be seen in the works of Madame de Lafayette or l'Abbé Prévost, or of Diderot, for instance. But in the Romantic period, the novel became a space for the exploration of the fictional self. And while the principle of equality was replaced by the ideas of exception, the idea of freedom remained a core literary theme. One of the recurring elements in French Romanticism is its interest in other spaces. I would like to focus on two in particular. On the one hand, the mythical East, and on the other, the New World, America and the Pacific Islands. The interest in Eastern countries started long before the 19th century. The 17th century author Racine wrote Bajazet, a play that took place in a contemporary Ottoman harem, arguing that the geographical distance served the same purpose as the historical distance required in French tragedies. In 1721, Montesquieu wrote his Lettres persanes, where two Persian visitors settle in Paris and offered a bemused criticism of French customs. In both instances, the east of the Mediterranean serves as a space of projection. While they wrote about distant countries, Racine and Montesquieu commented on the dangers of a despotic authority. Montesquieu is also notoriously the author of L'Esprit des Lois, the Spirit of the Laws, where he argues that a separation of powers might be a way to preserve the integrity of monarchy. Added to that heritage is the catalyst of Byron's Orientalism. Byron went to Greece to fight against the Ottoman invasion. His writings, especially Sardanapalus and certain pages of Don Juan, nourished the French interest in the Orient, both as a place of delight and wonder and as a place of violence. Eugène Delacroix, whom Baudelaire admired, was influenced by Byron too, and Delacroix depicted the death of Sardanapalus in one of his most vibrant paintings. When it comes to the New World, there too we can see the trace of previous centuries' political thought. Montaigne, in the 16th century, dedicated one of his essays to the cannibals. In the 18th century, Diderot wrote an addendum to Bougainville's travelogue, Supplément au voyage de Bougainville, where he praised the Tahitians' enjoyment of shared property and free love. While the Orient represented a state of extreme civilization, almost a decadence, the New World was a place of uncorrupt, almost childlike innocence. When the French Romantics reference America or the Bourbon Islands, now La Réunion, these lands are depicted as virgin lands, where people could become noble savages again. As Michel Foucault explains in Des espaces autres, these places are heterotopias. The island is a place that operates through a different rules than the mainland. It thus becomes the ideal fictional setting to establish a counter-model to what the inhabitants of metropolitan France would be accustomed to. Crossing the ocean becomes a rite of purification, through which the evils of society are purged. Georges Sand, too, resorts to that trope of pristine, innocent nature in Indiana, published in 1832. In spite of the very realistic surroundings where the heroes are confronted with the turmoils of the Republic and then the restorations, Indiana finally returns to Bourbon, her original island, with her one true love. After a dramatic attempt at suicide, Indiana and Sir Ralph establish a land of freedom and happiness, far from the corruption of metropolitan France, dedicating their resources to the redemption of slaves and the care for the sick. For Chateaubriand, the innocence of Native Americans is a proof of the génie du christianisme, the genius of Christianity. The Native Americans' sense of divine worship, of justice, of self-sacrifice, and natural righteousness would be an anthropological proof that men, even without being exposed to the Christian Revolution, would naturally tend towards a form of Christianity. For Chateaubriand, this is not just a matter of apologetics. He means to justify Christianity, especially Catholicism, against the attacks of the Revolution. There is no wonder, therefore, that his heroine, Atala, dies in an edifying Christian way, similar to that of early Christians he described in Les Martyrs. The counter-revolutionary reactionaries, on the other hand, like Joseph de Maistre or Blanc de Saint-Bonnet, wrote explicitly against that Rousseauian ideal of original innocence and explained the horrors of the revolution by original sin and by the necessity of sacrifice. But romantics of every political affiliation and none, like Chateaubriand, Benjamin Constant, or Victor Hugo, still nurtured the myth of an uncorrupt original nature that could be found in the New World. This would be the main feature that connects Romanticism to the idea that gave birth to the French Revolution. Romanticism should therefore not be seen as the product of revolution, but more as a reaction to it, tapping into what preceded it. I mentioned Chateaubriand, who also happened to be the translator of Paradise Lost into French. He is emblematic of French Romanticism insofar as his writings connect it to English and German Romanticism, but are also meant to denounce both the Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire. I will return to Napoleon later, but for now let us remember that Napoleon, like the revolutionaries, was steeped in the idea of the antiquity. He was a general who became a consul and then an emperor, and you could hardly be more Roman than that. Napoleonic art is academic and maintains the neoclassical taste of the revolutionaries. So when Chateaubriand turns his back on the ideal of the triumphant Roman Empire to focus on its decline in Les Martyrs, it is a barely veiled criticism of the pagan vitalism revered by the revolutionaries. In Le Génie du Christianisme, Chateaubriand contrasts the Greek and Roman philosophy, decisively oriented towards life, with early Christianity. Chateaubriand states that the persecutions in the early church led to a shift of paradigm through which being dead to the world becomes an ideal, later structured and sanctified through monastic life. Yet Chateaubriand notes that the most sensitive souls are now prey to a guilty melancholy. But nowadays, he writes, when ardent souls fail to find monasteries or to gain the virtue that leads into them, they found themselves estranged among men, nauseated by their century, scared off by their religion, they remained in the world without surrendering to the world, and thus they became prey to 1,000 chimeras. Thus, we saw the birth of that guilty melancholy that can grow among passions when these passions devour themselves aimlessly in a solitary heart. Mais de nos jours, quand les monastères ou la vertu qui y conduit ont manqué à ces âmes ardentes, elles se sont trouvées étrangères au milieu des hommes. Dégoûtées par leur siècle, effrayées par leur religion, elles sont restées dans le monde sans se livrer au monde. Alors, elles sont devenues la proie de 1000 chimères. Alors, on a vu naître cette coupable mélancolie qui s'engendre au milieu des passions, lorsque ces passions, sans objet, se consument d'elles-mêmes dans un cœur solitaire. And indeed, if we were to diagnose French Romanticism, it would seem rather morbid and disenchanted. Yet most of the French Romantics, like Lamartine, Théophile Gautier, or Musset, were not old enough to take part in the Napoleonic adventure. Musset makes his own Byronic hero Jacques Rollat say the rather gloomy line « Je suis venu trop tard dans un monde trop vieux. I came too late into a world too old. » The post-Napoleon generation grew into a feeling of missed opportunity. They have missed the time of heroes. In his preface to La Confession d'un enfant du siècle, Musset diagnoses the sorrows of his generation by ascribing them to a sort of chronological displacement. All the disease of the current century has two causes, writes Musset. The people who went through 93 and 1814 bears two wounds in his heart. All that used to be is no more, and all that will be is not yet. Do not look elsewhere for a cause to our sorrows. Toute la maladie du siècle présent vient de deux causes. Le peuple qui a passé par 93 et par 1814 porte au cœur deux blessures. Tout ce qui était n'est plus, tout ce qui sera n'est pas encore. Ne cherchez pas ailleurs le secret de nos maux. This diagnosis, which Musset posits in 1836, was paradoxically already present in Chateaubriand's Le Génie du Christianisme at the very beginning of the century. Chateaubriand comments on different dispiriting of the soul and pinpoint the particular situation of his generation. In a state that precedes the development of passions, when our faculties, young, active, whole, but locked up, are only applied to themselves with no purpose and no objective. The more people grow in civilization, the more the state of the vagueness of passion increases, as something very sad then happens, and pinpoints the particular situation of his generation, which finds itself in a state that precedes the development of passions, when our faculties, young, active, whole, but locked up, are only applied to themselves with no purpose and no objective. The more people grow in civilization, the more the state of the vagueness of passions increases, as something very sad then happens. The many examples we have under our eyes, the multitude of books about man and his feeding, grant us skills without granting us experience. We are disappointed without having enjoyed. Some desires remain, and we have no more illusions. The imagination is rich, fruitful, and marvelous. Existence is poor, dry, and disenchanted. With our brimming heart, we live in an empty world, and without having tried anything, we are disillusioned about everything. C'est l'état qui précède le développement des passions lorsque nos facultés, jeunes, actives, entières, mais renfermées, ne sont pas exercées autre part que sur elles-mêmes, sans but et sans objet. Plus les peuples avancent en civilisation, plus cet état du vague des passions augmente, car il arrive alors une chose fort triste, le grand nombre d'exemples qu'on a sous les yeux, la multitude de livres qui traitent de l'homme et de ses sentiments rendent habile sans expérience. On est détrompé sans avoir joui, il reste encore des désirs et l'on n'a plus d'illusions. L'imagination est riche, abondante et merveilleuse, l'existence pauvre, sèche et désenchantée. On habite avec un cœur plein, un monde vide, et sans avoir usé de rien, on est désabusé de tout. This state of mind remains a constant through the whole 19th century, from the early romanticism of Chateaubriand to the poems of Verlaine in the 1880s. Le vague à l'âme becomes a mandatory attitude of the poet. While the Romantics' poems and their novels delved into the description of extremely individual feelings, they still tried to illustrate themselves in the political sphere, not through war, but through skillful rhetorics. And indeed, there was a lot to do under the Restoration than under the Second Empire, under the Restoration than under the Second Republic. What sort of monarchy should we return to? Is it still possible to believe in divine right and providence when it had been so easy to put the previous king to death? In spite or because of this yearning for renewal, the most famous Romantics did participate in the political life of their country. Alfred de Vigny was in favor of a moderate republic. Benjamin Constant was a supporter of Napoleon, then a Restoration deputy. Chateaubriand was Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, and so was Lamartine, who lost at the election that made Napoleon III president. The best illustration of Romantic politics could be the life of Victor Hugo, who defended the monarchy against the Republicans and was made peer of France in 1845, then became a Republican under the Second Republic in 1848, and went into exile as a protest against Napoleon III. Victor Hugo embraced the Shelleyan idea of the poet as a lawgiver. He too was influenced by Rousseau. He believed that the evils that men do are only linked to structural imbalances in society. It is to such beliefs that we owe Les Misérables, about which Hugo writes, "As long as the laws and customs will cause a social damnation which creates hells in the very midst of civilization and add a human fatality to the destiny willed by God, as long as ignorance and misery will roam the earth, there could be some use to such books as this one. Tant qu'il existera, par le fait des lois et des mœurs, une damnation sociale créant artificiellement, en pleine civilisation, des enfers et compliquant d'une fatalité humaine la destinée qui est divine, tant qu'il y aura sur la terre ignorance et misère, des livres comme celui-ci pourront ne pas être inutiles." Some of the Romantics might disagree with the 1789 revolution, but they support the idea of revolution in general. It is Romanticism of every political shade which made the aspirations to liberté, égalité, fraternité the essence of Republican France. Marianne might have existed as a rather stiff and rigid statue of the Republic during the First Republic, but it is the brush of Eugène Delacroix that gave her flesh and movement in that painting of 1830, La liberté guidant le peuple, where the little boy holding up a gun is said to have inspired the character of Gavroche in Les Misérables. There is something of a teenage thirst for justice in Romanticism, in the best possible way, even if that desire for justice ended up being unjust. The revolutionary argument that the Romantics rejected most strongly was the cult of reason. The revolutionaries wanted to replace the Catholic cult with a worship of a divinity, la déesse raison, and most churches and cathedrals, such as Notre-Dame de Paris, Notre-Dame de Chartres, Saint-Sulpice, la Basilique de Saint-Denis, or the Exil Sainte-Geneviève, now the Panthéon, when they did not get destroyed, were turned into temples for reason. Against this trend, the Romantics focused on the biggest counterculture of the 18th century, Illuminism. While the Enlightenment stated that the human mind could grasp everything through reason, Illuminism went even further, that the human mind was capable of receiving revelation through direct intuition. At the crossroads between Romantic generation was obsessed with the immaterial. The materialism of the Enlightenment and the horrors of the Revolution resulted in a particular interest in the afterlife, soulmates, reincarnation, and so on. Prosper Mérimée, who was Senator, Inspector General of Historical Monuments from 1833 and 1830. The materialism of the Enlightenment and the horrors of the Revolution resulted in a particular interest in the afterlife, soulmates, reincarnation, and so on. Prosper Mérimée, who was Senator, Inspector General of Historical Monuments from 1833 to 1853, and incidentally the author of the short story Carmen, the tastes folklore and for statues coming to life in La Vénus d'Ille. Théophile Gautier wrote about young dandies falling in love with mummies and Roman patricians falling in love with explorers, about the evil eye and reincarnation, and about coffee pots coming to life at night. Through love and memory, imagination was free to infuse reality with supernatural life. As Lamartine wondered, inanimate objects, would you then have a soul that clings unto our soul and compels it to love? Objets inanimés, avez-vous donc une âme qui s'attache à notre âme et la force d'aimer? And supernatural creatures creeped into contemporary settings, from the werewolf of Petrus Borel to the ghosts of Charles Nodier. According to the thesis presented by Philippe Muret in Le 19e siècle à travers les âges, the post-revolutionary taste for the supernatural is inseparable from a political event even more decisive for the French Revolution than the storming of the Bastille. Back in 1780, the Cimetière des Innocents was so full of bones and decaying bodies that it overflew through the walls into neighboring buildings. This was a sanitary emergency at a time when medicine was speculating about germs and miasmas. While for centuries people had used the cemetery as a trading place or a playground, the era of new medicine called for a clear separation between the living and the dead. So an order was given to excavate the cemetery and to lay the bones to rest in the underground network of quarries under Paris, which was finally completed in 1786. And for many nights, several convoys of whitened bones crossed the town as priests were blessing the remains. While the excavation aimed to sanitize the public space by separating the living and the dead, it only forced the population of Paris to see decay face to face and to contemplate equality in death. This is the shift of paradigm that, according to Philippe Muret, justified the execution of the king and the destruction of the monarchy. As a result, the excavation of the Cimetière des Innocents, while precipitating the revolution, left us with two fundamental monuments of French Romanticism: the catacombs, where the mass grave is over-aestheticized through macabre sculptures, and the Panthéon, formerly Église Sainte-Geneviève, desecrated during the Revolution and now dedicated to the remains of great men. These two landmarks symbolically place Paris between the nameless dead of the past and the great men who made its present. For all its ultra-rationalism and rejection of the supernatural, the Revolution only managed to plant the soil of a secular cult of the dead. The more the French and the Second Republic tried to reject institutional religion, the more the Romantics delved into the natural religiosity of man. Victor Hugo wrote that he was in favor of religion and defending it against religions. The melancholy bitterness of the disenchanted Romantics took the shape of a struggle against the melancholy bitterness of the disenchanted Romantics took the shape of a struggle against or within the invisible through frenetic Romanticism. All the mysterious pains of the Romantic heroes and heroines, the consumption, the neuralgias, the suicidal ideations, must have a cause that lies beyond reason. And this is where the Romantics and the reactionaries end up being paradoxically close to one another. I mentioned that Joseph de Maistre was particularly harsh against Rousseau and his heirs. Yet de Maistre was not a radical rationalist either. He would in fact agree with Rousseau and with the Romantics on the fact that intuition can grasp what reason fails to understand, and he even sees this as justification for superstition. Against Voltaire and Diderot, Maistre argues that superstitions hold the permanent truths that did not need to be written and explained. And for him, the suffering of the innocent or the nameless diseases that no medical help could cure pays the price for the collective sins of society. Among these nameless diseases, of course, incurable melancholy was seen as the proof of an artistic temperament that might give birth to a work of genius. Which leads me to the final part of this talk. What is really original about Romanticism? In order to understand the Romantic Revolution, we would have to imagine this generation of creators writing and painting in front of an audience that saw art as a means of civilizations, as a way to spread peaceful principles and to elevate the soul. There had been enough gore in the Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, so people wanted nice, sweet paintings and poems about shepherdesses and flowers. But Romanticism broke a fundamental Platonic alliance between art and the beautiful, the true and the good. All of a sudden, art's purpose was not to establish a perfect harmony pleasing to the eye, but to explore the limits of what Kant could call the sublime. I was reluctant to talk about Baudelaire much in this lecture because on many respects he's more of a post-romantic. Therefore, I will ask you to take the line I'm going to quote with a considerable amount of salt, given that it is hard to tell if Baudelaire was being genuinely desperate writing it or very sarcastic. In a prose poem, Le Confiteor de l'Artiste, Baudelaire writes, "Nature, merciless bewitcher, ever victorious rival, leave me. Do not tempt my desires and my pride any longer. The study of beauty is a duel where the artist throws a terrified scream before falling vanquished. Nature, enchanteresse sans pitié, rivale toujours victorieuse, laisse-moi, cesse de monter mes désirs et mon orgueil. L'étude du beau est un duel où l'artiste crie de frayeur avant d'être vaincu." Let's assume that Baudelaire is not deriding the romantic cliché of the poet moaning and weeping in front of a sublime landscape, but is expressing a deep problem of aesthetic theory here. And let's take what he says at face value. There is something in nature that is beyond art's grasp. Sometimes it is because the real world is too beautiful. A painter might endeavor to seize all the shades of a sunset, but will he ever succeed before night falls? The painter, as an imitator of nature according to the Platonic and Aristotelian principle of mimesis, is bound to fail. But that is not what the Romantics try to do. They try to seize something that lies beyond harmony, beyond goodness, and that may in fact be repulsive. That is what people thought when they saw Le Radeau de la Méduse by Géricault, a painting that described the historic event of a shipwreck where the survivors, embarked on a raft, were decimated by starvation before being rescued. The people of the time knew the story well. They knew that the men on that raft only survived thanks to cannibalism. Géricault had originally sketched an even more explicit version, but changed his mind, and the painting we can now see at the Musée du Louvre was already horrible enough to shock his contemporary audience. So here's what the Romantics did. Instead of focusing on the healthy and the wholesome, they wanted to see the problem of evil face. They were more interested in decaying ruins than in wholesome buildings, and preferred mock medieval buildings to solid classical architecture. It is to this aesthetic that we owe both Notre-Dame de Paris and the architect Viollet-le-Duc's effort to restore the cathedral and turn it into the major international landmark we know. Before Hugo published Notre-Dame de Paris in 1831, the cathedral was derelict. The book served as a national heritage and tourism campaign, raising awareness about the importance of Gothic architecture and medieval Paris. But even further than that, Hugo's Notre-Dame de Paris started a new artistic trend. The medieval era allowed for the exploration of the grotesque as an artistic possibility. The gargoyles and Quasimodo made ugliness and monstrosity a plausible literary theme in contrast with the beauty and purity of Esmeralda. We have become somehow insensitive to the contradictions of the Middle Ages, but the beauty of Gothic cathedrals could not be understood without the romantic interest in the obscurity that makes the stained glass so dazzling, without the scenes of damnation that makes the representations of the blessed, of the angels and saints, and of God beautiful beyond words. It is in the Romantic period that people realized that the 1,000 years that gave us the cathedrals could not be seen as dark. In spite or because of all the political instability in France, the first half of the 19th century was a period of incomparable fruitfulness. Lamartine would write his preludes, and Liszt would set them to music. Alexandre Dumas fils, the son of the author of The Three Musketeers, wrote the novel La Dame aux Camélias in 1848, and less than a decade after, the theatre play, in turn, was adapted into an international blockbuster through its adaptation as an opera, La Traviata, by Verdi. For all their poses and their affectations, the Romantics endeavored to make art more vibrant, less contrived than what the academic rules of art had expected. Victor Hugo notoriously wrote, "J'ai mis le bonnet rouge au vieil alexandrin. I put a revolutionary Phrygian cap on the classical Alexandrine French verse." And we might have a hard time imagining nowadays what it would have been to be young at that time. I would like to leave you on the image that struck me most when I was a teenager and summarizes the vibrance and intensity of Romanticism as a lived event more than a theory. In 1830, Victor Hugo wrote Hernani, a play that shattered all the conventions of French classical theatre in verse. On the evening of the premiere, most of the old guard of French literature went to boo the play. But Hugo's friends and defenders also went, and the evening ended in a fight between the long-haired romantics and their detractors. The scene was sketched in such a way that you can still see Théophile Gautier grasping the collar of one of the people who dared to criticize the play. If there is one thing that we could recover from the Romantic period, it would be this sense of passion about the arts. Art cannot be reduced to entertainment, to a mere distraction. It is the means through which we can grapple with the most intricate, painful, and fascinating aspects of the human condition. Yet we also owe the Romantics the greatest delusion of our time, namely that artistic creation is the feat of an inspired genius and has little to do with dedication and hard work. While all the authors I mentioned, Chateaubriand, Hugo, Baudelaire, were people of remarkable literary style who mastered their craft perfectly. In a way, we are still possessed by the Romantic ideal of the misunderstood and radically original artist who woke up one day and produced a work of art, the accursed poet whose work is not just for his time, but for the generations to come. We have seen that each of these authors, while claiming originality and independence, is in fact heavily indebted to the previous generation and even to philosophers and ideas they might disagree with. Perhaps the greatest success of Romanticism is that it made us forget about its philosophical and political roots, while it made us believe that its revolutionary idea of art as a transgression and revolt had always been present in humanity.